I think, you know, when Steve Croft first was the first team leader of Fresh Expressions, one of the things, I think it was Steve who coined that definition of a fresh expression that we've all come across, a form of church for our changing culture, primarily for the benefit of people not yet members of any church, principles of listening, service, incarnational mission and making disciples, and then this final one, it will have the potential to become a mature expression of church, shaped by the gospel and the enduring marks of the church and for its cultural context. And I think that while so many people have ticked the box and yeah, that's fantastic, I think that final paragraph in there in particular, we really haven't a clue what we're doing with it. Because the key question was always there, really is a fresh expression really a church? Is it actually a fresh expression of church? Or is it some newfangled, trendy, missional outreach initiative that will get people into church, whatever church looks like? And what's the difference between a real church and a missional outreach? And I think we see that highlighted by the rise of messy church, which the vast majority of messy churches, I mean, sometimes I look at messy churches and I think, well, actually I was doing much messier stuff like 20 years ago, but we thought it was Sunday school, you know, we didn't think it was messy church. And it was great fun, and nothing wrong with it, but I think there's this question, okay, what's the difference between a real fresh expression of church and something that's just a missional outreach? And I think that has somehow, from what I can see, that I think has slipped down the agenda, that question, in recent years. I think it was top of the agenda where Steve Croft placed it, and it's gradually slipped down the agenda so that Fresh Expressions is in danger, I think, of becoming, okay, let's do whatever looks as if it'll work, pragmatically, which of course is not a bad missional perspective to have, but eventually is storing up the kind of questions of, okay, what is going on here, who's in, who's out, what does it mean to be a Christian? Whereas actually what I hear is from people who are actually trapped in institutions is we need somebody to be a prophetic voice. We need a body that we can own, i.e. Fresh Expressions, but which isn't just going to reflect the struggles we already have, that can be trusted by us because we own it to some extent, but he is a prophetic voice to say, what about this, and how about that, and you should be doing, and this is what the gospel calls you to, and so on. And I think identifying that question, what is Fresh Expressions for, and how does it work, both recognising the struggles and the reality of institutional life while being a prophetic voice and speaking into it, is one of the big kind of things that's floating around there that's largely unspoken and unrecognised, but is a key kind of question, because I think for me personally, the prophetic voice speaking into a safe space in the institutions, which is what we can be. I mean, believe it or not, I'm regarded as a safe pair of hands because I'm old enough to have been around and not blown the whole thing up, I suppose. But I think one of the key things that, as I reflect on the last 10 years, one of the key things that Fresh Expressions has actually done is to rehabilitate words like mission, actually, which are now on the lips of people in all different parts of the church, regardless of their theology or ecclesiology or whatever. And that's quite an achievement in itself, that many different traditions are now talking about mission, whereas previously it was embedded in the life of a certain section of the church. That's what they do, but we just do church. And I think that I see that very latterly, actually, in the Scottish Episcopal Church, the Anglican Church in Scotland, which I worship in, and eventually a tradition which really would have shied away from anything to do with mission or evangelism and so on, we're now embarked on the process of headhunting for pioneer ministers in the diocese in Glasgow and Galloway, which is a major, it sounds a simple thing from the perspective of some of you, but is I think another key thing is that actual people have actually come to faith. You know, there's been a fear in some circles that there are a lot of disgruntled Christians, and they're just fed up with church as we know it, and they're looking for new, fancy, trendy ways of doing things. And I think the publication earlier, right at the beginning of this year, the Anecdote to Evidence survey done by George Lings for the Church of England really surprised us all when he discovered that something like 40% of all people in fresh expressions were completely and absolutely with no previous church connection. Because I think the suspicion until that point was that large numbers of people were probably de-churched, and probably quite a chunk of people who were just angry with the church, who were there to sort of hold two fingers up to the rest of us and say, we're doing it right. Whereas if you look at his statistics, I don't know whether you're familiar with them, but he surveyed roughly a quarter of the diocese of the Church of England, not quite 25%, but near enough a quarter. And in that survey discovered that there were 65,000 people involved in fresh expressions for a start, which he speculated is the equivalent of a whole diocese in the Church of England. Of course, there are other statistics as well. This very week, earlier this week, Statistics for Mission, Church House Westminster released some other statistics which pointed in continuing decline for the Church of England and so on, which actually I thought was still encouraging, because the decline wasn't as big as you might have imagined. And other statistics published recently by Peter Brierley of now Brierley Research, who used to be Christian Research, again suggested that fresh expressions had done the equivalent of halting 6 years worth of decline in statistical terms in the British churches, if you get what that means. All these statistics though actually highlight a big question over what exactly do we count when we're drawing up statistics, because predominantly we still only count things that happen on Sundays in all our traditions, and it might be that we're actually depressing ourselves into a much bigger hole than we're actually in, for two reasons. One is that messy church, which is probably the biggest form of fresh expression. We could have a long conversation as to whether messy church is a fresh expression, but messy church has exploded and typically doesn't happen on a Sunday, and typically doesn't feed into denominational statistics, because we don't know whether it's really church, I suppose, what it is we're counting. So there's a question over what we actually count. I think there's another statistic that came to my attention just recently, and that is that some of you will be familiar with the work of Leslie Francis, who over a period of decades actually has collected personal information about church leaders and church members from the perspective of personality types. And overwhelmingly, like 90-something% of church leaders and members turn out to be ISTJs in Myers-Briggs terms. We don't need to argue about whether Myers-Briggs makes sense or not, but you know, he discovered, not surprisingly, we are people who like things predictable, McDonaldized in a way actually. We know exactly where things are going, how it's going to work, everything in its place, and so on and so forth. Now, you might have come across more recently that the government embarked on what they called the Happiness Project to both measure our happiness levels and also to encourage us to be happier. And as part of that, on their happiness website, they commissioned a survey of the personality types of the British population. Now, statistically and methodologically, I have no idea how they did that because they don't tell us. But the interesting thing for me was that according to that survey, they reckon that roughly 10% of the population are ISTJs. Now, 10% of the population is near enough, give or take, the body of people that traditional churches can actually connect with. So could it be that our missional question isn't actually about faith at all, it's about people who are saying, and I think this resonates with what somebody said about Forest Church and other things a minute ago, that there are people out there who say, well, if I was going to follow Jesus, never in a million years would I do it that way, but if it matched, I would do it a different way, whether it's Forest Church or Sunday Assembly or you know, whatever else might be out there. So is it the case that I've been just thinking about this and I'm throwing it out because I don't know what I think about it actually, but we might be doing better than we realise amongst the people who would say, yeah, that's my way of doing life really, this structured, organised kind of way that you do worship. In which case we certainly have a challenge, but it's the challenge of the glass that's 10% full and 90% empty. And what would people look like? What would it look like for people who are ENFPs, for example, to follow Jesus? Which is a really good question because both Leslie Francis and me are both ENFPs, so that's a big question we've talked about more than once. But I wonder if that personality type thing factors in somewhere to our mission. So the biggest form of fresh expression is messy church, and I think that, you know, is very tactile, very emotive, very intuitive. Well, in Lucy Moore's head it is anyway, and in her messy church. But I've been to enough messy churches in traditional churches to know that the ISTJs so easily take over. No, the glitter doesn't go there, it goes here. And you put a blue star there and it should, you know, which actually, yeah, you've obviously been in the same one, you see. So actually I think messy church, the mention of messy church highlights one of our big challenges, I think, to move on to that. So I think we have a lot to be really very excited about and encouraged by, is what I want to say. At the bottom of all these questions, I think, is a big question that is still unspoken, that nobody wants to go near, really, and that is, what exactly is the gospel? What are we actually inviting people to, I'll say sign up to, but you know what I mean by that. What actually is the good news for people today? And I think that is a fundamental question that's floating around under the surface somewhere that nobody seems to know how to address, because actually, and it comes down to it, well, okay, is there Anglican good news, and is there Methodist good news, and is there Baptist good news, and do these good newses overlap, or are they all in competition, or what is that about? You know, I think there's that whole question, which is a big theological question, is floating around there as to what exactly are we calling people to do, and how do we discover what that is? Now, of course, for me, I look at Jesus and I see Jesus actually giving people experiences and then asking them key questions, like, you know, whether the experience is just hanging out with him, talking about stuff, or healings, or whatever. And he then asks those who are having the experiences, okay, so what did you think about that, or how about something else? He continually asks questions. He virtually never gives an answer. And when he's pressed to give an answer, he tells a story that could mean a million different things. Which is why I think that, and that matches our culture today, is what I would say. That people having experiences, we are an experience-heavy culture today. Mostly people don't care about the theory that's behind any of the experiences, supposing there is one, which increasingly there isn't. What does it look like for us in our churches to give people experiences of what discipleship looks like, what following Jesus looks like, what it means to be a Christian, however you want to define it, and then journeying with people in such a way that we can ask those questions. Okay, so what did you think about what happened last Thursday at night, or 5 minutes ago at Forest Church, or whatever, and learning how to ask those questions in helpful ways, creating safe spaces for people to move on, while actually, and this for me is actually fundamental as well, recognising that the gospel continues to speak to us, and that conversion, if you want to use that term, is an ongoing process.